My name is Dvora Shmulewitz, and as Mario suggested, you'll be able to hear it from me today. I'll start by the potential effects of the war on mental health, focusing on common mental health disorders, PTSD, anxiety and depression, along with problematic substance use and addictive behaviors and their association with trauma due to October 7th terror attacks and the ongoing war. Okay. Whoops, let's see. No. This? Okay. So there are two goals of the presentation today. First, as Mario said, we'll talk about the prevalence of the various disorders that we're discussing. We'll describe change over time in mental health disorders, in problematic substance use, in problematic behaviors. In these three topics that we'll talk about, we're talking about prevalence of what we're considering to be a dichotomous disorder. So that's saying that not a number of symptoms, but at a certain point we're going to cut and say above that number is disorder, and that we'll talk about prevalence of those disorders. We'll also discuss change over time in some of the war-related stressors, and that will be the beginning of the talk. The second part, we'll talk about comorbidity, how these things happen together, and we'll use a special method of analysis called network analysis to identify which of the mental health disorders, PTSD, depression, and anxiety, are most uniquely related to which of the substance and behavioral addictions. Okay, and then we'll... Okay, thanks. I'm sorry. Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and then we'll add in as well, looking at trauma exposure and ongoing stress from the war, how that is related to the comorbidity of addictions and mental health disorders. Okay, to do this, we have a very rich data set. We have collections from, in the points in blue are times that we collected data from the general population, adult Jewish population in Israel. Started off in January 2018 as well as April 2022. And then after October 7th, we quickly put together another data collection to have a time point after the beginning of the war, and that's December 2023 and February 2025. These data sets were built to be quasi-representative. That means that they match the general Jewish population in Israel on key sociodemographics, age, gender, religiosity, and area of residence. Data sets in green from March and June 2024 are samples that were collected from the data set that was collected in December 2023, such that over time we have people were collected at more than one time point, so we have longitudinal data on a population level, data sets that were collected from the general population over time, as well as on the individual level, people who responded at multiple time points. Okay? In these data, we have a number of questions that were collected that are the same over all time points, such as sociodemographics, problematic substance use. So we asked about this list of common substances in Israel. We have potentially addictive behaviors that are listed here. We have questions on mental health. Specifically, we're interested today in PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And all those questions, we have many questionnaires that are common over all the time points. And then we have questionnaires about risk factors and protective factors, examples of which are listed here. Now, those questions could be, sometimes they're the same over time, and sometimes we added or changed depending on what was going on. For example, in December 2023, we have questions about exposure to October 7th, and so on. So, and the questionnaires that we are used in our study are generally available on the ICAMH website under resources. You're welcome to go look at the website specifically, and you can see all the different questionnaires that were used over time. Okay, so we'll start by just talking about the prevalence and what we see going on over the past. I'll start by looking at from April 2022. In these graphs, we're just going to focus on the time points that were more like quasi-representative, so the ones in April 2022, December 2023, and February 2025, where the samples in some way represent the general Jewish adult population in Israel. And it's just descriptive. We're going to look over time, what do you see that's going on in terms of the different disorders that we're discussing? On the x-axis, we have the time, and the y-axis is the prevalence of a dichotomous or a binary defined disorder. So for example, we could look at PTSD as we expect. PTSD increased from about 12%, so it's PTSD defined by a certain number of PTSD symptoms. And again, with the caveats that we're still in ongoing trauma, we're calling it PTSD because we look at PTSD symptoms, so you could call it potential PTSD. Prevalence of about 12%, start from April 2022, increased to about 25% in December 2023, and then start to go down to about 15% in February 2025. As we might expect, that over time, there's a big event and a big change, and over time things perhaps start to decrease. Measures of anxiety and depression, we actually didn't start collecting until December 2023, so we don't really have a before time point. But we can see there as well that anxiety, about 17% in December 2023, and goes down to about 11% in February, and depression, about 9%, goes down to 7%. Just to reiterate, I'm not going through each of these, what the threshold is for defining this binary disorder, and of course if you use a different threshold, you get different numbers, but based on these standard thresholds that we are using, and anybody who wants to know afterwards, I'm happy to talk about it, what we used, we're looking more at the change, like describing what's going on. This is the percent based on our threshold and what's going on, what's changing over time. In terms of problematic substance use, we see that prevalence of problematic use of tobacco seems to be going down slightly from about 36% in April 2022 to about 33% or 32% between December and February. Similarly, with problematic use of alcohol, we see also a decrease from April 2022, about 13% to about 11% in December 2023, but seems to be going up again perhaps to February 2025. Substances that stayed the same over time include cannabis, which stayed about 11%, problematic use of cannabis stayed about 11%, and other drugs at about 2%. In terms of the prescription medication, and this is non-medical use of prescription medication in a problematic way, and here we see an increase. We definitely see an increase in sedative use, from about 4% in April 2022 going up to about 10 or 11% in December and 10% in February. Similarly, we see increases in problematic use of prescription stimulants, about 4% to about 5 or 6% in February. And for prescription opioid painkillers, that went up to about 4.5% in December and February 2025. Okay? Now, just the same idea, just looking at the prevalence of problematic behaviors, potentially addictive behaviors. Most of these, we have range in December 2023 about 3% to about 8% for problematic behaviors. And most of them seem to have gone up in December 2023, but then perhaps are decreasing again or kind of staying the same. So last, we looked at the frequency of war-related stressors. In this case, we asked in December 2023, in the period since October 7th, since the beginning of the war, how frequently were you exposed to sirens or explosions? How frequently did you feel like your family or yourself was in danger? How frequently were you exposed to uncensored war materials? And how frequently were you exposed to hate speech on social media? In March and in June 2024, we asked in the past 3 months, how frequently were you exposed? And in February 2025, we asked in the past 6 months, how frequently were you exposed? So the time frame is a little bit different, also depending on what exactly was going on at that time. But on average, you get an idea as to the ongoing stress. So, for example, for exposure to sirens and explosions, and here in the corner we could see the scale. So on average at the beginning of the war, people were exposed to sirens or explosions an average every week, and that kind of went down a bit, and then increased again towards February 2025, and we see kind of the same pattern for feeling of yourself or your family in danger. But for exposure on, let's say, to uncensored graphic war materials or to exposure to hate speech on social media, from the beginning of the war, there did seem to be somewhat of a decrease, but kind of leveled out as exposure, say about a few times. So there's ongoing exposure. Okay? All the graphs that I just showed were describing the change over time based on the prevalence that we see in the data sets that we collected. What we're working on right now, we haven't done yet, is to see what are the changes over time, to formally analyze the changes, taking into account which people from our studies who agreed to participate multiple times and who didn't. So taking into account the fact that over time the sample changes. It's some people are the same and some people are different. And then we need to test formally what exactly is going on with these changes. We say we see an increase, we see a decrease, seems to be staying the same, what's actually going on. So hopefully by the next the next month we'll have a report to put up on the website showing the actual statistical formal analysis of who agreed to participate over time and how that affects the changes over time in the prevalence. So that was the first type of the talk. As Mario said, we'll just see what's going on. Now I'm going to talk about the comorbidity of addictions and mental health. In this case, previously we talked about the prevalence of binary disorder, yes, no. And here we're going back to the continuous measure. So here we're talking each of our outcomes is a continuous measure of ranging from 0 to, lower value means less problems, higher value means more problems. And we're looking now at the data set from December 2023. And the idea is that if you would look at by each individual outcome, every pair of outcomes. So we look at PTSD, so we have 3 mental health disorders. We have PTSD, anxiety, and depression in green on the bottom. We have the addictive behaviors in blue, and we have the substances in yellow. If you look at every pair, look at the association between PTSD and gaming and PTSD and sedatives, every pair by pair, everything would be associated with each other. Okay? You can see in this graphic, the ellipses are the nodes. We call it a node. And they're all connected by edges. Those are the lines. And the lines indicate the correlation or the association between each of the 2 measures. And the thickness of the line indicates the strength of the correlation. So circles that are connected by thick lines, that means that they're strongly associated or strongly related to each other. For example, PTSD, depression, and anxiety are all strongly related to each other. And things that are lines that are weaker would be less strong. But in this case, as we said, we're looking at a picture where every pair, and as we know, addictions, behaviors, substance use, addictive, and mental health disorders are strongly related, and that's what we're seeing. But in this case, because we look at things that are 2 by 2, we don't know. Really, maybe what's going on is that some of the associations that we're seeing here are because A is connected to B, which is connected to C, so then A is connected to C. That really, the associations could be driven by other associations with related factors. And that's what we may be seeing in this picture. So network analysis is a method that we can use when we have multiple factors that we expect to be related to each other. And we say, well, let's look at all of them together, and let's take into account the associations of all of them at one time so that we can distill out what is uniquely related. That what we're going to look at is what's related above and beyond its relationship with other factors that make those factors related to each other. And the idea is to say, this picture is what we expect. It's a bit of a mess. Everything's related. But to get out another level of what's actually uniquely and directly related, the strongest way to say, okay, let's look at these first. There's something here that could be driving all these relationships. So when we do that, we get a much cleaner picture. And it's telling us that taking into account all the associations that are going on, here, these factors are the most strongly and uniquely related. So what we could see here is, as expected, what's strongly and most uniquely related are the things that are PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And they're all related. That's a cluster we expect to find. We also see that the substances are strongly clustered together with gambling. And we see sexual behavior and pornography measures clustered together, and we see that our technology-related addictive behaviors are clustering together. But in terms of what we're interested to say is, okay, that's what we expect. Now, across clusters, what's connecting the depression, anxiety, and PTSD cluster? Which behaviors or which substance addictions are they most strongly related to? So we can see that depression is actually related to higher levels of depression symptoms. It's related to higher levels of cannabis and sedatives. We have PTSD related to stimulants and sedatives. But what was most interesting to us was to see the real strong relationship between PTSD, depression, anxiety, and internet, social media, and smartphone, problematic use of these technologies. And that we wanted to focus on. Say, what's going on? We've heard already, even the previous lecture, they said, social media, what's the problem? So before we got to that, we just wanted to add in the traumas that we discussed. And we could see that, as expected, October 7th exposure is related to all different addictive behaviors and PTSD. But focusing on the bottom here, we see this strong relationship between PTSD and these ongoing stressors, specifically exposure to hate speech and exposure to graphic, uncensored war materials, which in turn are also related to social media and smartphone. So that gave us an idea for further study. So besides, the network analysis helps us first to distill what's uniquely related so we can think about comorbidity and how to approach it, prevention, intervention, and so on. But we also came to an idea as to what could be driving the relationship between PTSD, for example, and addictive behaviors, technology-related behaviors such as social media. So 2 studies that actually came out from that network analysis was looking at the association of uncensored war material with PTSD, which Maor was going to present in this session, and a second study that we did looking at increased exposure to hate speech on social media was related to increased PTSD severity, and that effect was stronger among people with emotional dysregulation. So just to summarize, what we saw today is just that substance and behavioral addictions and mental health issues are prevalent in the Israeli Jewish general population. Some addictions, problematic use of prescription medications, PTSD have increased. We see that in terms of the comorbidity, we have a strong association between technology-related behaviors and PTSD, perhaps somewhat due to what people are being exposed to on social media. And as expected, that we have traumas and war exposures that are associated with problematic substance use and behaviors and PTSD. Some limitations of the study are that we only have the samples that we're looking at are only of Jews and only people who are willing to be surveyed through we use iPanel survey company. And again, we don't know of the people who agreed to participate at multiple time points, how that affects what we're seeing, which we still have to do. We mentioned the prevalence is based on dichotomous outcomes, which depending on where we put the threshold, it could change. I described change over time, but we didn't formally analyze it yet. The network analysis that I presented is done in cross-sectional data. It was at one time point. So we don't know what the direction of the association is. For example, people with PTSD could be using substances or behaviors to cope with the distress, or people who are exposed to trauma could be using substances, and in that case, it affects their natural protective mechanisms and increases PTSD, and we don't know which comes first, but we can do studies that look at networks over time to see what may be driving what in what direction. And lastly, what really is important is to add in risk protective factors, like we put in the stressors into the network, see what's related, put other risk factors, put in protective factors like resilience, and see how that affects the association between addictions and mental health and stressors, and how that affects over time. Okay. In conclusions, these studies are important to do from one level of public health information, just to say what's going on, what's there, to raise awareness, and to make sure that we have proper allocation of resources, as well as understanding the comorbidity, so you can say which mental health disorders are connected to which addictions most strongly, to think about where you could start with prevention or intervention, as well as design hypotheses about what might be going on. For example, now we have a fuller story, and we can say we see a strong connection between internet, social media related behaviors and PTSD, and that's possibly somewhat due to exposure to hate speech and graphic media. So raise awareness in the public and among ourselves to be careful what you're looking at and what you're doing and what you're seeing. And that's all together. It gives you a picture of what's going on in the general population of Jewish adults that were studied in this sample. Thank you for listening, and thank you to our colleagues at the Israel Center for Addiction and Mental Health. We have we're really happy to collaborate with this really nice data set that we have. So please look at our website, reach out with any questions, and we'll be happy to continue doing great research together. Thank you.